Well, welcome again to our video sessions of community groups at The Pursuit. This week at our Sunday services, I had the opportunity to share a message that focused on the first line of what we refer to as the Lord's Prayer. And throughout that message, I talked about how, like the 12 disciples, we too sometimes question our ability to pray correctly. Maybe one of the reasons you call into question your ability to pray is based on not seeing your prayers answered. So today I want to spend some time giving some tips that may help you get your prayers answered. Before we get into that, with each group's video, we provide you with a group's discussion guide. You can access that guide in the description of this video, and you may even want to pause the video right now so you can pull up that discussion guide to follow along. Now, maybe your prayer life has gotten a little stale or you're troubled with unanswered prayers. I want to encourage you with a few tips that may help you as God is desiring and inviting us to pray to Him. And I will share with you 3 practical ways that you can improve your prayer life and hopefully see more prayers answered. Because if we're honest, that's what we all want, right? First, I want to encourage you to pray specific prayers. Too often we speak in very basic terms. We pray things like, God, be with me today. God, help me with my finances. God, give me peace. And I'm reminded of the story that's recorded in Mark chapter 10, in which Jesus encounters a blind man who is repeatedly crying out for Jesus to have mercy on him. To his credit, the man was very persistent, but he was not very specific. Jesus finally asked him, what do you want me to do for you? So the man finally told Jesus that he wanted to see, and Jesus restored his sight. The point isn't so much that Jesus healed the man, but rather that Jesus is inviting us to be more specific with our requests. There are several benefits we can expect to see from this. Being more specific in our prayers will force us into thinking about what it is exactly that we are asking and trusting God to do in our lives. Plus, if you're keeping a prayer journal like we talked about last week, how will you know if your prayer is answered if it's not specific? Next is an area that, if we're honest, this is where many of us fail. Many of our prayers aren't answered because we don't persist in prayer. So the second tip is to pray consistently. Many of us might pray 1 or 2 times, and then when God doesn't seem to answer us, we simply just give up. But if we use Jesus to learn from, we can see that He encourages us to pray repeatedly. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, Jesus said, knock and the door will be opened to you. Have you ever gone over to someone's house that you were invited to, and when you knocked at the door, you just left after the first time you knocked? No. You knocked a second and maybe third or fourth time. You persisted until they opened the door. You knew they were home and you expected them to answer it. And in the same way, God is inviting us to keep on knocking until heaven's door clearly opens and God answers your prayers. Why doesn't God just give you what you want the first time? Well, because persistent repeated prayer demonstrates that you truly believe in your own heart that God is going to be able to do what you ask Him to do, and He has the ability to bring to pass what you're praying for. And having faith always pleases the heart of God, so maybe God is waiting to answer your request until He sees your faith in Him through your persistent prayer. And do you have a prayer that you have given up on praying for because you haven't seen God answer it in the timetable that you gave Him? Well, I encourage you to be persistent in prayer until you get a clear answer from God, no matter how long it takes. Finally, pray with a pure heart. We see several reasons in the Bible in which God doesn't answer your prayers, regardless of how hard and persistent you may be praying. Maybe you have some sin in your own life that you haven't dealt with. Psalm 66:18 tells us, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. And this sin could be in several different forms. In the Bible, we see several specific examples. In 1 Peter 3, we see that we are not to have marital conflict. God is like, if you're not treating your spouse right, don't come asking me for anything. And maybe you've offended someone. In Matthew 5:23-24, we're taught that if you've offended someone and you haven't sought out that person's forgiveness, well, then God tells us not to come asking Him for anything. It could be unforgiveness you're dealing with. Matthew 6:14-15, we see Jesus teach that if you're unwilling to forgive others, God won't answer our prayer because we're unwilling to do the very thing that opens the door for us to pray to God. Or maybe there's simply an ongoing sin that you're living with in your life. It could be a secret sin that you think nobody else knows about, but God knows. And perhaps your lack of pure heart is that you're approaching God with wrong motives. James 4:3 says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So we need to make sure to check the condition of our heart before ever asking God for anything. Starting today, make sure when you pray, you make sure that first of all, you're praying very specific prayers. Secondly, no matter how tired you get, persist in prayer. And finally, be sure that your heart is pure before God. And before you end your time together as a group, make sure that you take time to share your own thoughts with the group. And I encourage you to spend time going through the discussion guide together. And as always, make sure that you're spending time to pray together as a group, as well as provide an environment to share prayer requests with one another.